Have you ever noticed that the people who command the deepest respect are rarely the ones who speak the most? They don't rush to defend themselves. They don't write long messages to clarify what they meant. They don't spend sleepless nights wondering whether someone misunderstood their intentions. And yet, people listen when they speak. Their presence fills the room before their words ever do. Now think about the opposite. Think about someone who constantly feels the need to explain. Someone who justifies every decision, every absence, every boundary, every change of heart. I didn't answer because I was busy. I wasn't trying to be rude. I hope you don't think I'm selfish. It wasn't what it looked like. At first, this seems harmless, even considerate. After all, isn't communication supposed to solve misunderstandings? That is what most of us believe. But Carl Jung spent his life exploring something that exists beneath our conscious thoughts. He believed that human behavior is rarely driven by the reasons we give ourselves. Instead, it is often guided by forces hidden far below awareness. And according to Jung, the constant need to explain yourself is almost never about communication. It is about fear, not the obvious kind of fear, not the fear of danger, but the quiet fear of losing acceptance, the fear that if someone misunderstands you, they might reject you. Most people never notice when this fear takes control of their lives because it doesn't arrive dramatically, it doesn't announce itself, it slips into ordinary conversations, into everyday decisions, into relationships, into work, into family gatherings. One explanation becomes another, one apology becomes another, one justification follows the next, until eventually something strange happens. You no longer speak because you have something meaningful to say. You speak because silence has become uncomfortable. Silence begins to feel dangerous, as if every unanswered question might damage the way people see you. Little by little, your emotional balance stops belonging to you. Instead, it becomes dependent on the opinions of everyone around you. Without realizing it, you begin living before an invisible audience. Every decision passes through the same filter. What will they think? Every choice requires approval, every opinion needs permission, every disagreement feels like a threat. The exhausting part is that this never ends. No matter how carefully you explain yourself, someone will still misunderstand. No matter how honest you are, someone will still question your motives. No matter how kind you become, someone will still decide you are wrong. Yet many people respond by explaining even more, as though one more sentence, one more message, one more conversation will finally convince everyone to see them correctly. But it never does, because the problem was never misunderstanding. The problem was believing that your inner peace depends on being understood. That single belief quietly becomes one of the greatest prisons of adult life. Jung believed that freedom begins the moment this illusion starts to break, because there is a profound difference between expressing yourself and defending your existence. Healthy communication shares truth. Fearful communication seeks permission. Most people confuse the two. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack every single day. At first, you barely notice its weight. Your body adapts. Your shoulders become accustomed to the pressure. Years pass. Then one day you finally place it on the ground. Only then do you realize how heavy it truly was. The need to explain yourself works the same way. You become so accustomed to defending your choices that you no longer recognize how much energy it consumes. Every conversation requires preparation. Every disagreement becomes exhausting. Every boundary feels like a courtroom where you must prove your innocence. Eventually, you stop asking whether your decision was right. You begin asking whether people will approve of it. This is the silent transformation Jung warned about. The center of your life slowly moves outward. Instead of trusting your own experience, you begin trusting the reactions of others more than your own intuition. That is where inner authority begins to disappear. Ironically, the more desperately someone seeks understanding, the less convincing they often become. Have you ever wondered why? Why do certain people say very little, yet everyone seems to respect them? Why can one person calmly say no, and the conversation ends, while another offers 10 minutes of explanations, only to be questioned even more? The answer has very little to do with communication skills. It has everything to do with psychology. People rarely respond only to words. They respond to certainty. Not arrogance, not superiority, certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from someone who has stopped negotiating with themselves. That kind of presence cannot be faked. It cannot be learned from motivational quotes. It cannot be created by pretending to be confident. It emerges naturally when a person's identity no longer depends on constant approval. Jung believed that reaching this point requires confronting something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Not another person, not society, not criticism, but themselves. Because the need to explain yourself did not begin yesterday. It did not begin in your first relationship, or your first job, or your first disappointment. It began much earlier, long before you ever realized it existed. long before you learned how to hide it, long before you became the adult you are today. Somewhere in childhood, a lesson was quietly written into your unconscious, a lesson so powerful that it continues shaping your conversations decades later. You may believe you are simply being polite, but what if something much deeper is happening? What if every unnecessary explanation is actually an attempt to earn permission, to feel, to choose, to exist? If that possibility makes you uncomfortable, it should, because understanding where this habit was born may completely change the way you see yourself. And before you can ever stop explaining yourself, you must first discover who taught you that your existence required an explanation. No one enters the world believing they must justify who they are. A child doesn't apologize for laughing too loudly. They don't explain why they're excited. They don't defend their tears. They simply experience life. When they feel joy, they express it. When they feel pain, they cry. When they are curious, they ask questions without wondering whether someone will think they're foolish. There is something profoundly honest about a child before the world begins teaching them who they should become. Carl Jung believed that the early years of life shape much more than our memories. They shape the unconscious patterns that quietly guide our adult behavior. Most of these patterns are created without words. A child doesn't need someone to say, "Your feelings don't matter." They only need to experience that message enough times. Imagine a little boy running excitedly into the living room. He wants to show his parents a drawing he spent an hour making. To him, it is a masterpiece. He expects someone to smile, someone to notice. Instead, without even looking up, one parent says, "Not now." Another replies, "I'm busy." Nothing dramatic happened. No one yelled. No one intended harm. But the unconscious rarely remembers intentions. It remembers emotional experiences. The child quietly reaches a conclusion. Maybe what matters to me isn't important. Days become months, months become years. The lesson repeats itself in different forms. A teacher dismisses a question, a friend laughs at an idea, a sibling mocks an emotion, an adult says, "You're too sensitive. Don't make such a big deal out of it. Stop crying. You're overreacting." Each sentence seems small, almost insignificant, yet together they build something enormous. A belief, not a conscious belief, an unconscious one. The child slowly begins asking a question they were never born asking. Are my feelings acceptable? That question changes everything. Because once your emotions require permission, your identity soon follows. If your sadness needs approval, then perhaps your opinions do too. If your anger isn't welcome, perhaps your boundaries aren't either. If speaking honestly risks rejection, perhaps silence is safer. This is how adaptation begins. Not because children are weak, because children are brilliantly designed to survive. They learn whatever they must learn in order to remain connected to the people they depend on. If love feels conditional, they adapt. If acceptance seems connected to obedience, they adapt. If approval comes only when they are agreeable, they adapt again. Over time, the adaptation becomes invisible. It stops feeling like a strategy. It simply feels like who they are. Years later, the child has become an adult. They believe they are simply considerate. They think they naturally over-explain because they like clear communication. They assume apologizing constantly is a sign of kindness. But beneath those habits often lives something much older. A frightened child still trying to avoid emotional abandonment. Jung understood that the unconscious never truly forgets. Experiences that are never examined don't disappear. They become patterns. Patterns become habits. Habits become personality. And personality eventually begins to feel like destiny. That is why so many adults repeat behaviors they never consciously chose. They apologize before speaking. They feel guilty for saying no. They panic whenever someone seems disappointed. They rehearse conversations in the shower. They replay arguments while trying to fall asleep. Not because those situations are truly dangerous, because their nervous system learned long ago that misunderstanding could threaten connection. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten. Have you ever noticed how quickly your heart begins racing after receiving a short message that simply says, "We need to talk"? Nothing has happened yet. No conflict exists. And still, your imagination immediately begins searching for mistakes. What did I do? Did I say something wrong? Are they upset? Should I explain myself before they accuse me? The conscious mind believes it is preparing for a conversation. The unconscious believes it is preparing for survival. That difference changes everything. Jung often observed that what we call personality is frequently a collection of adaptations. Many of the traits we proudly identify with began as solutions to childhood fears. The person who never disappoints anyone. The person who always keeps the peace. The person who avoids conflict. The person who smiles through pain. The person who explains every decision. These identities are often admired. Society rewards them. People call them mature, reliable, easygoing, responsible. But very few people stop to ask a difficult question. Responsible for whom? Easy for whom? Reliable according to whose expectations? Sometimes the qualities that earn us praise are the very qualities slowly separating us from ourselves. That is one of Jung's most uncomfortable insights. The world can applaud a version of you that your own soul barely recognizes. Imagine living 20 years inside a house where every mirror is distorted. Every day you look into the glass and slowly accept that reflection as reality. Then one day you finally see yourself in a clear mirror. The difference shocks you, not because you changed, because you had forgotten what you actually looked like. Psychological growth feels remarkably similar. The first time you begin listening to yourself instead of everyone else's expectations. It feels unfamiliar. Almost selfish, almost wrong. Not because it is wrong, but because your unconscious has associated self-trust with danger for so many years. This is why change feels uncomfortable. Not because the new path is unsafe, because the old path became familiar, even when it hurt you, even when it exhausted you, even when it slowly erased your voice. There comes a moment, however, when something inside refuses to continue living that way. A quiet part of you begins asking questions. Why am I so afraid of disappointing people? Why do I feel guilty every time I choose myself? Why do I explain decisions that require no explanation? And perhaps the most important question of all, who would I become if I stopped asking the world for permission to exist? Jung believed the answer to that question could never be found by changing other people. It required looking inward, because hidden beneath all those adaptations, beneath every explanation, every apology, every attempt to be accepted, there is another version of you, one that has been waiting patiently, one that existed before fear taught you to perform. Jung gave that performance a name. He called it, imagine walking into a room where everyone expects you to behave in a certain way. At work, they expect you to remain professional. With your family, they expect you to be agreeable. With friends, they expect you to be entertaining. In a relationship, they expect you to be understanding. Without realizing it, you begin changing your face for every room you enter. Not physically, psychologically. Most people call this maturity. Carl Jung called it something else. He called it the persona. Contrary to what many people believe, the persona is not a lie. It is not hypocrisy. In fact, it serves an important purpose. Without it, society could barely function. Imagine saying every thought that entered your mind, expressing every emotion without restraint, ignoring every social convention. Human relationships would quickly collapse. The persona allows us to live together. It teaches us courtesy, patience, self-control, respect. The problem begins when the mask is no longer something you wear. The problem begins when the mask becomes someone you believe you are. That transformation happens so gradually that almost nobody notices it. As a child, you discover that certain parts of yourself are welcomed, others are not. You receive praise for being quiet, so you become quieter. People admire you for avoiding conflict, so you stop expressing disagreement. You are rewarded for putting others first, so your own needs slowly disappear from the conversation. None of these choices feel dramatic. They simply feel practical, reasonable, necessary, until one day you wake up and realize something unsettling. Everyone seems to know who you are except you. This is one of the greatest paradoxes Jung ever described. A person can become incredibly successful while feeling completely disconnected from themselves. They may build an impressive career, create a beautiful family, earn admiration from friends, receive constant compliments, yet inside, there remains a strange emptiness, not because something is missing from their life, because someone is missing themselves. Think about how often people answer questions automatically. How are you? I'm fine. Are you happy? Of course. Do you want to come? Sure. The answers arrive so quickly that they bypass genuine reflection. The persona has learned what is expected. It responds before the authentic self has a chance to speak. Jung believed that every time we silence our genuine experience in order to protect an image, we create distance between who we appear to be and who we actually are. At first, that distance is almost invisible, but over the years, it grows. Imagine drawing two lines on a piece of paper. At the beginning, they sit almost side by side, barely separated. If each line shifts only 1 millimeter every day, the difference seems insignificant. But after years, the distance becomes enormous. That is how many people lose themselves. Not through one life-changing decision, through thousands of tiny compromises. One smile when they wanted to speak. One apology they didn't owe. One dream postponed because someone else didn't approve. One opportunity abandoned because they feared criticism. One honest opinion swallowed to avoid conflict. Each moment seems harmless. Together, they create a completely different life. The frightening part is that society often celebrates this transformation. People describe you as dependable, easygoing, flexible, selfless. But inside, another voice quietly begins asking questions. Why am I always exhausted? Why do I feel invisible even when people appreciate me? Why do I feel lonely in rooms full of people who love me? These questions rarely have external answers because the loneliness does not come from lacking company. It comes from lacking authenticity. You cannot feel fully known while constantly hiding the person you truly are. That is impossible. People can only connect with the version of you that you allow them to see. If they love the mask, the real you still feels unseen. That is why so many admired people secretly struggle with emptiness. They are surrounded by affection, yet uncertain whether anyone actually knows them. Imagine spending 20 years performing the same role in a theater. Night after night, the audience applauds. Critics praise your performance. You become famous for the character. Then one evening, after the curtain falls, you return home and realize you can no longer remember where the character ends and where you begin. This is precisely what Jung feared. Not that people would wear masks, but that they would forget they were wearing them. Once that happens, life becomes a performance directed by expectation rather than truth. Every decision asks the same question. What version of me will be accepted? Very few people ask the opposite question. What is actually true for me? That question is frightening because honesty carries consequences. The moment you stop performing, some people become uncomfortable not because authenticity is offensive, but because they had grown accustomed to the version of you that was easier to control. Someone who always explained themselves, was predictable, someone who always apologized, was easy to influence, someone who never defended their own needs, rarely created conflict. The persona protects peace, but sometimes it protects peace by sacrificing freedom, and eventually your unconscious grows tired of that sacrifice. It begins sending signals: restlessness, burnout, chronic anxiety, a strange feeling that your life no longer belongs to you. Most people mistake these feelings for stress. Jung believed they often represent something much deeper, the authentic self knocking from beneath the mask, quietly asking to be heard again. But the persona is only half of the story. Because every part of yourself that the mask refuses to show does not simply disappear. It goes somewhere. It waits, patiently, silently, deep within the unconscious. Jung gave that hidden place a name that would become one of the most influential ideas in modern psychology. He called it, if the persona is the part of you that the world is allowed to see, then where do all the other parts go? What happens to the anger you were never allowed to express? The confidence people called arrogance? The sensitivity they called weakness? The ambition they said was selfish? The dreams they convinced you to abandon? Do they disappear? Carl Jung believed they do not. Nothing that belongs to your psyche simply vanishes. It only moves. The parts of yourself that become unacceptable to your conscious identity are pushed into the unconscious. Jung called this hidden territory the shadow. Few psychological concepts have been misunderstood as much as this one. Many people hear the word shadow and immediately think of evil, violence, hatred, cruelty, but Jung meant something far more profound. The shadow is not only everything dark within you, it is everything you refuse to become, everything you were told was unacceptable, everything that never received permission to exist. Imagine a little girl who is naturally outspoken. She asks questions, challenges ideas, speaks confidently. Adults constantly interrupt her. Be quiet. Stop arguing. Nice girls don't behave like that. Little by little, she learns that speaking freely costs her love. Years later, people describe her as calm, reserved, easy to deal with. But what happened to the courageous child she once was? She didn't disappear, she entered the shadow. Now imagine a boy who cries easily, he feels deeply, he is compassionate. Every time he cries, someone tells him, be a man. Boys don't cry. Stop acting weak. Eventually, the tears stop. But the emotions don't. They simply move somewhere he can no longer consciously reach. Years later, he struggles to connect emotionally with his own family. He believes something is wrong with him. Nothing is wrong. He is simply living far away from an important part of himself. This is how the shadow is born, not through evil, through rejection. Every time you reject a part of yourself, your unconscious keeps it. Like placing forgotten belongings in a locked room. The room becomes fuller every year. Eventually the door begins to shake. Not because the shadow wants to destroy your life, because it wants to be acknowledged. Most people misunderstand this. They spend years trying to eliminate uncomfortable emotions, trying to become permanently positive, trying to remove anger, fear, jealousy, sadness. Jung believed this was impossible. What you resist internally does not disappear. It becomes stronger. It waits patiently beneath consciousness until the right moment appears. Then suddenly, a A small disagreement becomes explosive. A minor criticism ruins your entire week. Someone ignores your message and you immediately feel abandoned. The situation seems small. The emotional reaction feels enormous. Why? Because the emotion doesn't belong only to the present moment. It carries the weight of years, perhaps decades. This is why Jung believed that our strongest emotional reactions are rarely about what is happening now. They are about everything that happened before. Imagine someone accidentally stepping on an old injury. The pain isn't intense because of the pressure. The pain is intense because the wound already existed. Emotional wounds behave the same way. Life doesn't create all your reactions. Often, life simply reveals them. That realization changes the way you see other people. Instead of asking, "Why did they make me feel this?" you begin asking, "Why did this affect me so deeply?" The first question gives your power away. The second begins taking it back. Jung called this process projection. Projection happens when we unknowingly attribute hidden parts of ourselves to other people. Have you ever met someone who irritated you almost instantly? Perhaps they appeared too confident, too outspoken, too ambitious, too emotional, too independent. Their behavior seemed unbearable. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. What if your reaction wasn't only about them? What if they reminded you of a quality you buried long ago? The same happens in reverse. Think about someone you deeply admire. Perhaps they possess extraordinary confidence, peace, authenticity, freedom. You believe you admire them because they have something you lack. Jung suggested something different. Perhaps you admire them because they are expressing a part of yourself that has been waiting to return. That possibility changes everything. It means the people who disturb you and the people who inspire you may both be mirrors. One reflects the wounds you have ignored. The other reflects the person you could become. Life suddenly stops feeling random. Every meaningful relationship becomes an invitation. Every conflict becomes a lesson. Every emotional trigger becomes a doorway leading back to yourself. This is why Jung insisted that psychological growth does not begin by changing other people. It begins by becoming conscious of what lives within you. Until then, your shadow quietly guides your life from behind the scenes. It chooses your reactions, your fears, your relationships, even the people you repeatedly attract. And because you cannot see it, you call it fate. You say, "Why does this always happen to me? Why do I keep meeting the same kind of people? Why do I always end up explaining myself?" Perhaps the better question is this: what invisible part of you keeps creating the same story? Because until that question is answered, nothing truly changes. You simply meet different people in different places who awaken the very same wounds. But the moment you begin integrating the shadow, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing your own emotions. You stop running from uncomfortable truths. You stop needing constant approval because you are no longer ashamed of the parts of yourself you once hid. For the first time, your identity begins to feel whole. And when that happens, the need to explain yourself starts disappearing naturally. Not because you learn better communication, but because your existence no longer depends on someone else's permission. Still, there is one final transformation that Jung believed every human being must eventually face. It is not enough to recognize the persona. It is not enough to meet the shadow. There comes a moment when both must be brought together, a moment when the person you pretend to be and the person you truly are must finally become one. Jung called that lifelong journey. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. At first, those words sound almost poetic, simple, even obvious, but the longer you sit with them, the more unsettling they become. Because becoming who you truly are is not the same as becoming someone new. It is remembering the person who existed before fear taught you to perform. Jung called this lifelong process individuation. It was, in his view, the highest psychological task a human being could undertake. Not success, not popularity, not perfection, wholeness. Most people spend their lives trying to become better versions of the mask they already wear. They improve their communication, their appearance, their career, their reputation. Yet they rarely ask a far more important question. Who is living this life? Is it the person they truly are, or the person they learned would be accepted? There is a profound difference. One life is built from authenticity. The other is built from adaptation. From the outside, they may look almost identical, but internally, they feel completely different. The adapted life is exhausting. Every decision requires calculation. Every conversation becomes strategy. Every disagreement feels dangerous. Every criticism feels personal. Because the persona is fragile, it survives only as long as other people continue believing in it. The authentic self is different. It does not depend on applause. It does not collapse under misunderstanding. It does not disappear when someone disagrees. It simply simply exists. This is why truly authentic people often appear calm even in uncomfortable situations. Their stability does not come from controlling the opinions of others. It comes from no longer depending on them. Think about the people whose presence immediately commands respect. They are rarely the loudest, rarely the most persuasive, rarely the ones trying hardest to convince everyone. Instead, there is something quiet about them, something grounded. When they speak, they do not seem desperate for agreement. When they remain silent, they do not appear uncomfortable. When someone misunderstands them, they do not immediately rush to repair their image, not because they enjoy conflict, but because they understand something most people never learn. Being misunderstood is part of being human. The moment you express yourself honestly, someone will interpret your words through the lens of their own experiences. Someone will hear criticism where none existed. Someone will assume intentions you never had. Someone will create a story about you that exists only inside their own mind. You cannot control that. You never could. Yet countless people dedicate enormous amounts of energy trying. They explain, clarify, defend, correct, rewrite conversations in search of the perfect sentence that will finally make everyone understand. It never arrives, because the problem was never language, it was attachment to being perceived correctly. Jung believed that suffering often begins when we cling to illusions, and one of the greatest illusions is believing that we can manage another person's perception of us. You cannot. Their perception belongs to them, just as your perception belongs to you. Imagine standing before 10 different mirrors. Each mirror is shaped differently. One stretches your reflection, another compresses it, another bends it sideways, another darkens the image, another brightens every detail. Now ask yourself a simple question. Which reflection is the real one? None of them. Each mirror reveals something, but none possesses the whole truth. People function in much the same way. Every person sees you through the shape of their own history. Someone who was betrayed may struggle to trust you. Someone who grew up criticized may mistake honesty for judgment. Someone who fears abandonment may interpret your independence as rejection. Someone who constantly seeks control may call your boundaries selfish. None of these reactions define you. They reveal the lens through which you are being observed. Understanding this changes the emotional weight of criticism. Instead of asking, "How do I convince them?" you begin asking, is there actually something here for me to learn? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes criticism reveals a blind spot, an unconscious habit, a genuine mistake. Growth requires humility. Jung never suggested ignoring reality. But there is an equally important truth. Sometimes criticism reveals nothing about you. It reveals everything about the person speaking. Wisdom is learning the difference. That distinction cannot come from other people. It must come from within. This is why Jung insisted that self-knowledge is not a luxury. It is protection. The better you know yourself, the harder it becomes for someone else's opinion to define you. Imagine someone calling the ocean shallow. Would the ocean argue? Would it defend itself? Would it produce evidence of its depth? Of course not. Its depth exists whether anyone recognizes it or not. The same becomes true for a psychologically integrated person. Their value is no longer something they negotiate. It simply is. That quiet certainty changes every interaction. Suddenly saying no becomes simple. Not because you enjoy disappointing people, because you understand that disappointing someone is sometimes the price of being honest. Setting boundaries no longer requires lengthy speeches. Your explanations become shorter. Your apologies become fewer. Your words become more intentional. Something fascinating begins to happen. People who respected only your compliance slowly disappear. They become frustrated, confused, sometimes even angry. They say, "You've changed," and they are right, you have. Not because you became colder, but because you stopped abandoning yourself to keep everyone else comfortable. At the same time, something else happens. People capable of genuine relationships begin responding differently. They trust you more, not less. Because authenticity creates clarity. Others know where they stand with you. They no longer have to guess. There is remarkable peace in becoming predictable through honesty instead of performance. This transformation is rarely dramatic. There is no single morning when you suddenly awaken fearless. It happens in quiet moments. The first unnecessary apology you choose not to give. The first invitation you decline without inventing an excuse. The first disagreement you survive without trying to change someone's opinion. The first time someone misunderstands you, and you allow them to. Those moments seem incredibly small, yet together, they begin reshaping your identity. Little by little, your nervous system learns something it never believed before. I can remain myself, even when someone disapproves. That realization changes everything. Because the child who once feared rejection slowly becomes an adult capable of self-respect. And self-respect carries a kind of gravity that no performance can imitate. People feel it before they understand it. They cannot always explain why your presence feels different. They simply notice that you no longer seem to be asking them for permission. You are no longer negotiating your worth, you are living it. Ironically, this is often the moment respect begins to appear. Not because you demanded it, because you stopped chasing it. But there is one final lesson Jung believed separates psychological maturity from mere confidence. It is the understanding that true freedom does not come from controlling the world around you. It comes from mastering the world within you. And that is where the deepest transformation finally begins. Perhaps this is the greatest misunderstanding of modern life. We spend years believing that respect is something other people decide to give us. We believe that if we become more agreeable, more accommodating, more understanding, more available, then eventually people will value us. But life has a curious way of exposing the truth. The more desperately you seek respect, the more you begin negotiating away the very qualities that inspire it. Little by little, your voice becomes quieter, your boundaries become weaker, your decisions become easier to influence, not because you lack intelligence, not because you lack character, but because somewhere along the way, your desire to be accepted became stronger than your commitment to yourself. Jung understood that this conflict is not solved by becoming harder. It is solved by becoming whole. There is an enormous difference. Some people stop explaining themselves because they become bitter. Others stop because they become indifferent. Neither path leads to freedom. True psychological maturity is something entirely different. It is remaining kind without becoming submissive. It is remaining compassionate without abandoning your own truth. It is remaining open while refusing to betray yourself for the comfort of others. This balance cannot be learned from a script. It cannot be copied from someone else's personality. It emerges naturally when you finally know who you are. And that knowledge is earned, not through endless thinking, but through honest observation. Notice how often you explain things that require no explanation. Notice how often you apologize for taking up space. Notice how often you change your opinion before anyone even challenges it. Notice how frequently your first instinct is not to ask, "What do I believe?" but rather, "What will they think?" Awareness is where transformation begins. Jung believed that whatever is made conscious loses much of its unconscious power. The moment you recognize a pattern, you are no longer completely controlled by it. Imagine waking tomorrow with one simple intention, not to become fearless, not to become emotionally detached, only to pause before your next unnecessary explanation. Someone questions your decision. You breathe. Instead of immediately defending yourself, you simply answer, "This is what feels right for me." Nothing more. No long speech. No desperate attempt to erase every possible misunderstanding. Just quiet certainty. At first, your body may resist. Your heart may beat faster. Part of you will want to continue talking, to fill the silence, to recover control, but stay with the silence. Allow it to exist, because that silence is not empty. It is the space where self-trust begins to grow. Every time you resist the impulse to seek unnecessary validation, you strengthen something invisible. An inner foundation. And unlike approval, that foundation cannot be taken away by criticism. People may disagree with you. They may misunderstand your intentions. Some may even leave your life. For a long time, that possibility feels terrifying, until one day you realize something unexpected. The people who disappear were often connected to the version of you that no longer exists. They were attached to the mask, not the person beneath it. And although losing those relationships may hurt, keeping them at the cost of your authenticity would hurt far more. Because every relationship built upon a false version of yourself demands that the performance never ends. Eventually, the cost becomes unbearable. Jung often reminded us that the path toward wholeness is not comfortable. It asks you to face your fears instead of hiding them, to meet your shadow instead of denying it, to remove the persona whenever it no longer serves your truth, to stop searching outside yourself for the certainty that can only be discovered within. This is the quiet revolution that changes a human life. Not a louder voice, a truer one. Not greater control over others, greater responsibility for yourself, not becoming someone different, finally becoming someone real. Perhaps that is why the people who possess genuine inner authority seem so peaceful. They are no longer fighting an impossible battle. They have stopped trying to control how every person interprets them. They understand that every human being sees the world through their own history, their own fears, their own expectations, their own wounds. Trying to manage every perception is like trying to hold water in your hands. The harder you squeeze, the faster it escapes. Freedom begins the moment you open your hands. When you no longer need everyone to understand you. You become free to understand yourself when you no longer need everyone's approval. You become capable of respecting your own convictions, and something remarkable happens. The respect you spent years chasing quietly begins to appear. Not because you demanded it, not because you proved yourself, but because people instinctively recognize what you finally recognize within yourself. A person who no longer negotiates their own worth. A person whose kindness is genuine rather than fearful. A person whose silence carries more strength than endless explanations. Carl Jung believed that the goal of life was never perfection. It was integration. To bring together the parts of yourself that had been separated by fear. To stop living divided between who you are and who you think you must be. Perhaps that journey begins with something surprisingly simple. The next time you feel the urge to explain yourself, pause. Ask one question. Am I speaking from truth or from fear? If the answer is fear, allow yourself to remain silent. Not because silence always wins, but because not every misunderstanding deserves your energy. Not every opinion deserves your attention, and not every person deserves access to the deepest parts of your soul. Protecting your peace is not selfish, it is wisdom. Protecting your identity is not arrogance, it is responsibility. Protecting your inner truth is not rebellion, it is the beginning of freedom. And perhaps, for the very first time, you will discover that the person whose understanding mattered most was never standing in front of you. It was the one quietly waiting within you all along. Why people respect you when you stop explaining yourself. Carl Jung, Chapter 1. The moment you stop chasing understanding. Have you ever noticed that the people who command the deepest respect are rarely the ones who speak the most? They don't rush to defend themselves. They don't write long messages to clarify what they meant. They don't spend sleepless nights wondering whether someone misunderstood their intentions. And yet, people listen when they speak. Their presence fills the room before their words ever do. Now think about the opposite. Think about someone who constantly feels the need to explain. Someone who justifies every decision, every absence, every boundary, every change of heart. I didn't answer because I was busy. I wasn't trying to be rude. I hope you don't think I'm selfish. It wasn't what it looked like. At first, this seems harmless, even considerate. After all, isn't communication supposed to solve misunderstandings?